Things that speak to you, there's a chance that that wasn't the intention of the parable at all. Webster says that a parable is a short, fictitious story that illustrates a moral attitude or a religious principle. And it's in the midst of that kind of a wrapping around that this parable became a part of my life. I don't know what it was about the people that I was running with when I first became a Christian, but I became known as the prodigal. And it wasn't because I had ever really been home and then left. I had just become pretty wild. I grew up without a father. I grew up without supervision. I was in trouble really early, at a very early age, very early on in my teens, even before I was a teenager. I was in more trouble than I should have been. And when I finally did embrace the reality of what Christ had done for me and trusted him, the prodigal and this story became a part of the dialogue with me all of the time. It was a strange thing because really, father was not a good word for me. I don't know how many of you are like that, but I didn't grow up with a father. My father had never come for me. He had deserted me. And that word wasn't a good word. Home wasn't a good place for me. It was not a place that I longed to be. It was not a place I'd ever want to return to. But I got associated with this story, and it began to be part of the fabric as I grew up. As I grew into the man that Christ intended me to, there was lots of times in my history as I think back where I have sat with this story for long periods of time, taking great comfort in the actions of the Father. In the early 90s, something else changed. I got introduced to a book, and it was a book by a guy named Henry Nouwen, and it's called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And it's a journey where he got introduced and started thinking and meditating on this painting by Rembrandt, The Return of the Prodigal Son. Now, I know it's a strange thing to say, but at that time in my life, I knew very little about Rembrandt. I'd heard the name, but I had could never identify one of his paintings. And I got introduced to this painting through Henry Nouwen's book. Here's a picture of the painting, and it began to be something that I would sit with over long periods of time. I chose this particular one so that you can see things that you normally can't see when you see reproductions of Rembrandt's painting. The main thing are the characters that are in the background. In most prints that you'll be able to see the character that looks like a female character just over the left shoulder of the father, but the character that's in the far background at the top left, you can rarely see. The lighting on the reproductions is just not good enough to be able to see it. I began to sit with this painting, which is a strange thing because those of you who know me know I'm not exactly an artsy guy. But this painting began to speak to me in deeper ways. And I think God was using it to assure me about what kind of father he was and what kind of home he was preparing for me. It began to shape me in some very strange ways, very different and unique than anything else that had ever happened. Now, there's a lot of dialogue about this painting and who the characters are. The father is, of course, easy to recognize, and the son is easy to recognize. The rest of the characters are in debate. I don't believe the older son is in the painting at all. Some say the guy in the black hat might be the older son. Some say that maybe he's the character at the very back who looks feminine to me, so I'm not sure. I don't know. And you can sit with this painting and be able to do that if you would like. I began to get strangely attached to this painting. I placed it as my desktop on my computer. And then in the early 2000s, when I had the opportunity to go to Russia, the most exciting thing for me was going to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and sitting with this painting for a couple of hours. The painting in real life is amazing. It's 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, and it's just gigantic. I don't know why any painter would, unless they just didn't do small strokes well, I don't know why anybody would make big paintings like that. The characters in the painting are actually life-size. And as I began to sit with the painting now and think about it, I was drawn to a few things. First, you can see the father's posture and how he is embracing and moving down. And you can see the son. The son's head is shaved, which means he's been a slave. He's been serving in a slave capacity. But if you look a little bit closer at the hands, I think we can zoom in on them here. You'll notice, as I did, that the hands actually each look different. The left hand of the Father seems strong and tense, and you can see veins and tendons as it seems to have a certain amount of strength against the Son's shoulders. But the right hand of the Father seems relaxed and smooth, almost like a different hand, almost like two different people. And I began to think about how my God, as he's dealt with me in my past, is both strong and very, sometimes even stern. But there are other times when he is so tender and so compassionate and forgiving to me. I was also drawn to the feet of the Son. And when you began to look at the feet, it's just like me. You can see he didn't come back when he broke a shoestring and things started going bad. He had to go as long as he could until the sandals wore slap out. They would no longer stay on his feet. In fact, if they had duct tape back then, he'd have duct taped these sandals on. Of course, that's another issue, because if the Egyptians would have had duct tape, the Sphinx would still have a nose. So that's something else. But you can see that this Son, it took him coming to the end of himself. It took things going not poor, but absolutely wretched before he would come back. And this whole parable began to be intertwined into the fabric of my life. And then 3.5 years ago, some things happened at my home, some things with my sons that I was not pleased with. And I began to study anew, go back to this parable and pour myself into it. And so I'll introduce you to a few books that have helped me with this parable. One is by John MacArthur called The Tale of Two Sons. I've already mentioned Henry Nouwen's book. And then there's been a recent book that's come out called The Prodigal God by Timothy Keller, who we have shamelessly stole from in our subtitle of our series here. And I went back to this and I began to study it afresh. And to look into it. I went into it to justify some of the things and to affirm myself as a father and how I should respond. And a strange thing happened. I've always been easy to go to this. It's been easy for me to go into this story and to relate to it in a very kind way, in a very sympathetic way. It was always from the younger son's perspective, and it's such a cool story that way. A younger son kind of went off, and everything went to crud, and then he finally came back, and that was a censor, by the way. And he came back, and when he came back, the father embraced him. And when you come at it from that perspective, it's such a warm and engaging story. This young son who wanted nothing to do with the father, he only wanted his stuff. But a strange thing happened 3.5 years ago to me. I became amazingly aware of this. I was the older son. Something had happened. I don't know what. But I didn't want the father either. I wanted the things of the Father. You see, both of the sons are the same in that way. They don't want the Father. They want the things of the Father. And now, but when I began to try to identify, it was easy for me to see. If you say, oh God, I'm sorry, then you're a younger son. But if you say this, oh God, you owe me, you're an older son. And 3.5 years ago, when I began to wrestle with some of these things, I realized that the parable was not about what was going on in my home. It was what was going on inside of my heart. See, I actually thought God owed me. It's a subtle thing. It's a subtle thing that religious people do. You see, I had done things for God, and I thought I was gaining some kind of standing. I had left the great state of Texas and come to the granola state. Where I hung out with flakes and nuts. And I was a pastor. I'm a pastor. God, you owe me. And what I realized is I wanted all of the things of God to my shame. I want his peace. I want his power. I want his provision. I want the kinds of things. I want wisdom that he grants. I want all of those things. But it's a rare thing. It's a rare thing, men and women, when I just want the Father. No benefits, no blessings, just relationship with him. We began to sit on this series, basically. I couldn't bring it to you. It wasn't time. There was more to be done inside of my own life. And then last summer, when Mark and I began to lay out the year, we knew 2011 was it. And so for the next 6 weeks after today, we're going to take our time and move slowly through the journey that the young son goes through, the response of the father, and the hard-heartedness of the older son. And what I want to tell you is I believe it's going to blow apart some of your categories. See, you believe that life is about being bad or being good. And God makes decisions about where people go and spend eternity, about whether you were bad or whether you were good. We say bad people go to hell and good people go to heaven. But the truth of the matter is that only forgiven people go to heaven. Lots of good people have no standing before a righteous father because they're just like the older son. They want nothing to do with God. They just want the things of God. To be sure, the room is full of younger sons, people who are doing their own thing, trying to discover a way of making life work through doing what the world might say is a good thing. More of this, more of me. And there are certainly, at times, all of us are younger sons. But I think one of the things that's going to happen in this series is we're going to realize that there's actually quite a few older sons in the room. Now, in order to get a parable, you have to really be able to look at the context. And in a parable, Jesus will be answering or responding to a direct question most of the time, or a response. Here's rule number one. Jesus tells a parable to teach a specific topic or to answer a specific objection or question. Sometimes the topic is listed or explained inside the parable. The task of interpreting the parable correctly is to identify the topic from the context of the parable. In other words, if you don't know what Jesus is talking about, you might draw all kinds of wrong principles from the parable. Let me give you an example. In Matthew 20 through 25, there's a listing of lots of parables. In Matthew 20, there's a parable there where he talks about how a person who owns a vineyard hires a bunch of different people, and he hires some in the morning, he hires some in midday, and he hires some in the evening, and he ends up paying everybody the same. That is not a parable about how to determine wages. And yet people try to think it is. In Matthew 21, there's a parable about another person who owns a vineyard, and when he sends some people to kind of get his share of the crops, they beat him up, and so finally he sends his own son, and he says, surely they'll respect my son. And they end up killing the son. That is not a parable about how to graft a child into the family business. In Matthew 25, there's a story about 10 virgins and this wedding that's going on. And as they're talking about this, that is not a story about how to be a good friend, and it's not a story about premarital sex. It's a story about something completely different. And unless you understand the context, you will draw the kinds of principles out that, here's what I'll tell you, you'll go to the prodigal son looking for principles to parent. And there's most of the stuff that goes on in this, you would say never do as a parent. You got a wild kid who wants nothing to do with you. You're going to fill their pockets full of money and send them off? Really? The parable of the prodigal son is not about parenting. So what is it about? Well, to get it, we've got to understand, according to rule number one, what is the objection? What is the context that Jesus is speaking into? Let's see if we can find it together this morning. Luke chapter 15, verse 1. It says, now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear him. I love this verse. In fact, one of the versions translates it, the notorious sinners were gathering around him. These are the people not that just have sin, because everyone has sin, and the people in Jesus' day understood that. These are the people that either because of their vocation, prostitutes and tax collectors, or their past, or their brokenness, they are kicked out of society. They have to form their own culture because the normal, regular people, and certainly the religious people of that day, would want nothing to do with them. These are what I love, the notorious sinners. And it's this little phrase, we're all gathering around. That's in the tense of the verb that says this is what normally happened every time Jesus spoke. Here's an amazing thing about, as you just off the side of the thing here, but when you read about Christ in the New Testament, people that aren't like Jesus at all like him. They're not living according to any of his teachings. He is clearly a moral teacher. But they flock and love to be around him. There's another group, and it almost seems like there's almost exclusively these two groups every time they show up. It's called, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Your translation might say, the Pharisees and the experts in the law, or the Pharisees and the scribes. It says that they muttered, or another version says murmured. I love that word. It's hard to say murmur without smiling. So just try, just murmur. Some of y'all actually did it. You could say it without smiling, which is not a good sign for your life. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law. In other words, we've got the immoral over here, and we've got the moral over here. The moral are murmuring, and I can imagine without any kind of tact at all, they are saying, oh my gosh, Sally's here. Sally works at that home, that house, on First Street. They're letting men come in and out of there at all times. And there's Matthew. Matthew cheated me out of some tax a few years back. I've never forgiven him. This is what they murmured. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. He actually says, nice to have you. Glad you're here. Thanks for coming. Matthew, come follow me. Zacharias and Zacchaeus, I'm gonna go have lunch with you today. When it says that he would welcome them and eat with them, welcoming them was bad, but eating with them is even worse. Here's what that means. That phrase means Jesus is their friend. That's why in another place in the New Testament, when the religious decide that they're going to kill Jesus, they said he is a friend to sinners. He's obviously running with the wrong crowd. Now that's the context to when Jesus begins to speak a series of 3 parables. That's the objection. That's what's being said. And then Jesus speaks a series of 3 parables, one after another, the third one being the one that we'll land on for the next 6 weeks. But today, let's look at the other 2. Verse 3, Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls all his friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I found my lost sheep. That's not a parable about how to shepherd. I tell you this, in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over the 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Who is Jesus speaking to? The notorious sinners or the religious? It's not a trick question. Here, I'll do it where everybody can feel smart at the same time. Who is Jesus talking to? Do you think he is talking to the immoral people of his day, or is he talking to the religious? What a bright group. You're exactly right. The series of parables, and this is our first clue about what he's talking to, the series of parables are not addressed to the sinners. In fact, watch this, they're not addressed to the younger sons. Well, we got to see a theme to be sure, so let's look at the next parable. Or suppose, verse 8, a woman has 10 silver coins, loses one. Does she not light a lamp? Because she's poor, she doesn't have any windows in her house, so she would have to light a lamp. Sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it. And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I have found my lost coin. This is not a parable about how to clean your house. In the same way, just like that rejoicing of that woman, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels over one sinner who repents. Jesus says to those people who are murmuring against these notorious sinners that the heart of the Father is such and so predisposed that whenever any of them, just one of them, turns and softens and recognizes the love of God and repents of their ways and turns to Him, that God immediately throws a party and He invites all of the angels to come to it. Do you think of God like that? As the kind of Father who so longs for you to come back into His presence, to come back into His love and kindness, that He's waiting to throw parties when notorious sinners like you and me repent of our hard-heartedness and our lack of love for Him. Can you imagine how the crowd would have responded at that moment? You're over here gritching and moaning about who these people are. And I tell you, if one of them, if only one of them, listening to me teach today, responds in a repentful way and comes to believe in me, that there will be parties thrown in heaven while you murmur. You could not be no more mistaken about how you think God operates. And I think He would say the same thing to many of us. You think how to relate to God is by keeping rules. Being found has nothing to do with irreligion or religion. It's something brand new. It's not something in the middle. It's something completely brand new, where Christ has come and made an offer to us, saying there are no rules to keep. There are no hoops to jump through. In fact, if you could jump through them, it would not satisfy a righteous God. God's requirements can only be satisfied with perfection. And so I will come. I will bear the punishment for your sin, and I will rise from the dead and defeat death. This offer that I will be the good older brother. See, think about this for a minute. In the parable of the lost sheep, the shepherd goes and finds the lost sheep. And in the parable of the lost coin, the woman searches and finds the lost coin. Who goes and finds the lost brother? Answer? Nobody. No one. Now, let me ask you this. Who should have gone and found the lost brother? The older brother. This is a bright group. Not the father. It would have been the responsibility of the older brother to go. And this older brother is so into what he wants that he has no desire to try to right the relationships of the family. And we'll see that so clearly over the next several weeks. Jesus says, I'll come for you. I'll come and search you out. In fact, we can't even make it to the Father unless Jesus comes and finds us. He initiates that whole process. Younger brother, he says, listen, you're chasing after all of the wrong things, and you're going to find that those are empty, empty dreams. There's going to become a time in your life when you're going to realize the commercials lied to you. Real meaning and significance didn't come from driving that car. Nobody gives a rat's tail that you've got a camera in the back of your car that allows you to see where you back up. Now, that was not a statement. If you've got a camera in the back of your car, I think that's pretty cool. But what's not going to work is if you think that gains significance and impresses anybody, it only impresses the kind of people that you don't really want to be around anyway. That rat race is only won by the rats. And Jesus says, I came, and the Father's heart is so predisposed that he longs for you to come. He's waiting to throw parties in your name. Please, come home. Come home. But there's another group of folks in the room that Jesus is saying, I died for you too. You think you've got it all together. And in fact, if everyone here would say, you're such a good person. But being good has nothing to do with being found. Can I say that for you again? Being good has nothing to do with being found. The real tragedy of the parable of the prodigal son is not the younger son. He repents, comes home, and parties with the father. Where's the tragedy? The older son. The one in good standing to all of the religious of his day. The one who keeps the rules. And the father is saying, please come into the party. Stop trying to earn your way to me. I hope you'll come back. For 6 weeks, I hope you'll come back and look at this. If you're an irreligious, immoral person, glad to have you. In fact, you're in good company. And you're going to be surprised at how the God feels about you and responds to you and how he is pursuing you. But I will tell you, if you are religious and you are moral and you are good and you are proud and you're saying, I don't need this, you just might be the one who needs it most. Now, I know it's going to mess with your categories, so if you don't want your categories messed with, maybe you shouldn't come. But that's not what the Father would say. The Father is saying, please, please. I've not only loved you, I've demonstrated my love through Jesus Christ and his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. I have pursued you. I have things for you and blessings for you that you could never imagine. Come to me. We'll have a time to sit with this just now as we're going to take communion. Mark will introduce it and kind of take us through it. But as he does, I would encourage you just to sit with it, just to say, you know what, I'll read this challenge card that I want you to do. I'd like for you over the next 6 weeks to just put the card somewhere where you can find it. Read it once or twice a week. Become familiar with the characters and the different phrases that are used. In your life groups, we'll try to give you some opportunities to discuss it as well. Maybe it won't be as drastic of a thing as it happened to me. Maybe it'll just be a simple reminder of how the Father loves you. Let's take a look at it together. Let me pray for you and we'll take communion with Mark. It is amazing, God, that you would love us like this. It is amazing that in our rebellion, in our just blatant disregard for who you are, you pursue us. And then when our hearts become proud and we begin to think that you owe us, that you still navigate and work through that. God, I pray that we would respond in a way where you have to throw some parties, that we'll recognize that we need to repent, that we'll turn and come to you. Thank you for being the kind of Father who pursues us. Use this time of communion to not only minister to us, but to bring glory to Jesus. And we ask it in his name. Amen.
He welcomes sinners. These tables are prepared for us to come and to remember a God and a Father